I almost feel like I should put in a content warning for today's material, and but Andrea might have to cover Perrin's ears up a few times. But last time we started looking at the morality of the Roman Empire, and we looked a bit just at general morality. What did the Romans actually see as values, and how they were very, very different from what we have today. So today we're going to specifically, at least start by specifically looking at sexual values. How did they view sex? Because they viewed it very, very differently than we do. Basically, the Romans ended up adopting Greek sexual values, which were much more lax and libertine than traditional Roman sexual values were. Basically, Greek culture celebrated manhood in a lot of ways, and they celebrated male nudity, which is why all those Greek statues are always naked. And they very much revered male genitalia. They saw erect penises as symbols of power and dominance. So you see those all over Greek art, and then later on Roman art as well. So there was a lot of what to us would seem to be very shocking, pornographic images that to them were symbols of power and dominance. Greco-Roman society saw sex as very natural, and they didn't really connect sex and love at all, and they certainly didn't connect sex and morality. Sex was just seen as something you did. It wasn't really seen as anything having a moral component to it. Even adultery wasn't really seen as having a moral component. The only big problem was that you wanted to make sure that your heirs were yours and not some other person's. But it wasn't seen as a moral thing. So, and among the upper classes, promiscuity was incredibly rampant. It was just the norm. And things that we would think of not just as promiscuity, but as perversions were very common. Things like incest, wife swapping, sex with slaves and prostitutes, orgies, and even bestiality were basically seen as a matter of course. It wasn't a big deal. Again, no moral component to it whatsoever. Sex was just something you did. And there wasn't seen as any real limitations. Even some of the aristocratic women were notorious for just having very strong sexual appetites and very loose sexual practices. Caesar Augustus's sister, for example, Julia, was infamous. In fact, at one point, Augustus supposedly said, out of frustration, is there any man in Rome who hasn't slept with my sister? So among the upper classes, it was very much an anything goes situation. But the lower classes actually held to a much higher standard, and the kind of behavior that was common among the aristocracy could get a lower class person, a plebeian, sentenced to death. So it was very much, again, there was no sense of any kind of equality under the law. The upper classes get away with things the lower classes definitely couldn't. So sex in general, there was very little morality associated with it. And of course, homosexuality also was common, though their view of homosexuality was very complicated. It wasn't as simple as homosexuality is good or homosexuality is bad. And they actually had a lot of taboos associated with it, but they were different ones than ours. It's uncertain just how widespread it was in classical Greece and Rome. Again, among the aristocracy, it was very common. Among the common people, it might not have been nearly as well accepted. In classical Greece, for example, there were city-states that celebrated homosexual behavior and others that discouraged it. For instance, in ancient Sparta, which was known for having a very warrior-centric culture, you might think that kind of culture would look down on homosexuality. But in fact, it was seen there as the natural thing for men because, of course, a warrior is going to prefer the company of other male warriors and not weak women. And in fact, when a Spartan young man was married, his wife would shave her head so that, in that night in the dark, she would seem more masculine to her husband. Because he would have been used to only being with men up until that point, in every way. But there are other places, like in, Athens, where homosexuality was legal, but it was still seen as somewhat controversial. So to the Greeks, the ultimate ideal in sexuality was actually pederasty, which was a relationship between an adult man and a young boy. That was held up as the ideal relationship. And there's lots of Greek pottery that display that sort of behavior. Now, theoretically, the adult male was supposed to be sort of a mentor to the young boy, and their relationship wasn't necessarily supposed to be sexual, but it almost always was. Again, it was just seen as the norm. The man was supposed to mentor and educate the boy, and in return, the boy would provide favors for the man. And in fact, a lot of times, young male aristocrats would compete would compete to service the older men as a way of gaining political favor. A few years back, about 15, maybe even 20 years ago now, HBO had a television series called Rome, which dramatized, the life of Julius Caesar and the rise of Augustus and all that. And they put a lot of research into it to try and make the attitudes accurate. And, there's a scene there where Octavian, the man who would become Caesar Augustus' mother, thinks that he has serviced Julius Caesar and is congratulating him over gaining Caesar's notice, saying how much political favor he's going to gain by being Caesar's new favorite young boy. And that was very much the attitude they had. Starting with the Greeks and later on with the Romans who adopted Greek attitudes, that was seen very much as the ideal kind of relationship. Now, when it came to the Greek philosophers, some of them accepted homosexuality, others condemned it. Plato, for example, allowed for homosexuality in his model of an ideal society, and Plato almost certainly had that kind of relationship with his mentor Socrates. He almost certainly had a sexual relationship with him. On the other hand, Aristotle found men who allowed themselves to be violated that way to be just despicable. He despised them. And another Greek philosopher, Xenophon, criticized homosexual intercourse as unnatural because it treated men as women. And this is a lot of times the attitude you see with the ancient Greeks and Romans. When they opposed homosexuality, it wasn't because it was seen as bad, because it was, as the Bible says, abandoning the natural use of the woman. It was seen as bad because it debased men to the status of women. And a lot of the Greek philosophers argued against it on that basis. And the sort of men who allowed other men to do that to them were seen as effeminate. And in fact, if you think back to when Paul discusses all the things that won't be allowed in the kingdom, and he mentions homosexuality, he uses two Greek words there. He uses the word malakoi and the word asynikoitos. And the word asynikoitos usually gets translated as homosexual because it literally means man who lies with men. In fact, Paul sort of coined that word. The word malakoi means effeminate. And many, if not most scholars will say what he's referring to with that word or the men who would make themselves up to be more soft and feminine-like in order to gain the attention of older men to become sort of their sex toy. And that's one of the things that Paul is specifically condemning in 1 Corinthians. So this type of behavior was, very, very common, again, first in Greece, and then later on, because of Greek influence, it would get adopted by the Romans. And certainly in cities like Corinth, this would have been incredibly widespread, this type of behavior. And it would have been the type of behavior that Christians, converts, would have engaged in before their conversion. Now, not surprisingly, a lot of this preference that you see for homosexuality, especially in Greek culture, came because they had such a low opinion of women. The historian Norman Sussman says that homosexuality in Greece was closely linked to an idealized concept of the man as the focus of intellectual and physical activities. The woman was seen as serving but two roles. As a wife, she ran the home. As a courtesan, which basically just means prostitute, she satisfied male sexual desires. So I quoted another philosopher on this earlier that, men were said to have wives in order to have heirs and manage the home, and they had prostitutes for their pleasure. And that was their view. But in terms of actual relationships, the ideal relationship was seen to be between two men, because that was a relationship between equals, whereas a man's relationship with a woman was seen as lowering himself to the level, to having to lower himself to the woman's level, and the woman was seen to be far below the man. Another historian, Epicurus, says that classical Athens was a society dominated by men who sequestered their wives and daughters, denigrated the female role in reproduction. In fact, some of these ancient societies didn't believe the woman contributed to the baby at all. They thought the baby was implanted by the man and the woman just carried it. So they denigrated the female role in reproduction, erected monuments to male genitalia, and had sex with the sons of their peers. So that was the Greek attitude. Roman society attitudes were a little bit different. Again, homosexual sex was very common, but the Romans had sort of a code of propriety about it. They had taboos associated with it that, like I said, they were very different than ours. Basically, when it came to homosexual sex, if you were the man on top, so to speak, you were okay. If you were the man on the bottom, you were seen as less. You were seen as being denigrated and humiliated. So sex was all about, especially homosexual sex, was all about domination of one man by another man. So the man who was, on the receiving end was seen as acting effeminate, as acting malakoi, as to use the Greek word that Paul used. But again, for a wealthy, high-class Roman man, engaging in homosexual sex with boys was perfectly acceptable behavior, again, so long as you were the one on top, so to speak. As long as you were the one, in the power position, it was seen as a good thing. Again, the historian Paul Vane puts it this way. Keeping a boy for sexual purposes was a minor sin for gentlemen of the elite classes. Brutus, Caesar's murderer, kept a boy so beautiful that reproductions of a sculpture of him could be seen everywhere. Jealous wives refused to allow their husbands to kiss their boyfriends in their presence. However, the first sign of a mustache resulted in a major change in the life of a boy. With the onset of adulthood, the boy's long girlish locks were cut, and no longer was he treated as a passive sex object. So again, so long as you were a boy, it was okay. As soon as you became a man, you were supposed to move on to being sort of the one in power. Martha Nussbaum writes, ancient categories of sexual experience differed considerably from our own. The central distinction in sexual morality was the distinction between active and passive roles. The gender of the object is not in itself morally problematic. Boys and women are very often treated interchangeably as objects of male desire. What is socially important is to penetrate rather than to be penetrated. Sex is understood fundamentally not as interaction, but as a doing of something to someone. And another historian writes, with only a few exceptions, male homosexuality was not stigmatized or repressed so long as it conformed to norms regarding gender and the relative ages and statuses of the partners. Other than the Jews, none of the archaic civilizations prohibited homosexuality per se. So, one thing to realize here, and one thing that's really important, especially when reading about homosexuality in the New Testament, is to realize that the way that they did not perceive homosexuality in terms of identity. No one at the time thought of themselves as being homosexual. Homosexual acts were just another thing you could do. And it was expected that most men would engage in both homosexual and heterosexual sex. That again, it wasn't the gender that mattered so much as the position you were in when having sex. So the very idea of homosexuality as an identity is a very recent one. So when Paul and the other New Testament writers were writing about it, they weren't addressing homosexuality as an identity. They would not have seen, who you had sex with as being a component of who you were. It was an action that you did, and God said that action was sinful. In the same way that sin is always about action. It's what you do. That sin isn't who you are. Sin is about what you do. And they would have seen homosexuality the same way. Homosexuality wasn't who you were. A homosexual act was one thing you could do. And Paul and the other New Testament writers, and the Old Testament writers for that matter, were saying, do not do this thing. Because it wasn't seen as who you were. And again, the very idea of homosexuality as an identity is very, very recent. It dates to the Victorian era really at the earliest, and maybe didn't even come along till after that. So there's something to keep in mind when, nowadays homosexual people will say things like, well, you can't tell me not to be who I am. But the Bible says you don't find your identity in that anyway. Being gay isn't who you are. Being gay is what you do, and it's something you do that is sinful. Now, when it comes to women, it's harder to know how widespread homosexuality was and how accepted it was. Now, certainly some did. Even Paul mentions this in Romans 1 when it talks about women, burning in their lust for one another. And there were known lesbians, the most famous of which was Sappho, who was a female Greek poet who lived on the island of Lesbos, which is where we get the term lesbian from. And she was famous for writing love poetry to other women. It's somewhat debated, how much of a lesbian she was and how widespread lesbianism was, but it certainly seemed that it did happen. But it might not have been nearly as socially accepted as male homosexuality was. And it might not even been seen as sexual because no penetration was taking place. Because again, to the Greeks and Romans, that was what was important, and that was what determined your role. And so that was what determined whether you were in the power position or the submissive position. And again, to the Romans, it was moral to be in the power position and not in the submissive position. So that was basically the view of homosexuality that the early church was dealing with. So very, very different from the way we see it now. Very, very widespread among everybody except for the Jews. which is why Jesus never talks about it. Jesus didn't need to discuss it because the Jews already knew it was wrong. But Paul had to write about it a fair amount because he was the apostle to the Gentiles, and to the Gentiles, they had this very casual attitude towards it. Questions? All right, so the R-rated section of the lesson is over. Not the easiest thing to talk about, but I think it's important to understand, what the early church was dealing with and the culture they were, facing around them. So lastly, for our last topic, when it comes to Greco-Roman culture, we're going to look at public entertainment. Because entertainment is always a big thing in any culture. And entertainment is always going to reflect the values of the culture. So what was Roman entertainment like? Well, it was crude and it was brutish. It celebrated hedonism and violence, which gives you an indication as to, Roman culture as a whole. In Roman cities, wealthy patrons, in order to make them more famous, in order to increase their honor, would often finance the construction of enormous theaters and amphitheaters, things like the Colosseum in Rome. And the Colosseum was just one of many amphitheaters that were spread throughout the Roman Empire. You go to the ruins of pretty much any Roman city, there was an amphitheater there. And these public theaters would serve as venues for concerts, for dancing, for plays, drama, and the like. There were also what were called circus games, which were sporting events and gladiatorial games. And these could also be very brutal. I mean, obviously the gladiatorial fights were, but even the other forms of gaming could be very brutal and very violent. Now, public entertainment was very important in the Roman Empire. It provided mass entertainment. And more importantly to the elite class, it pacified the mob. Basically, it gave the unemployed urban population, which was very large, something to do so that they wouldn't riot. And so you would have fairly often games that were either free to get into or very cheap to get into. By the first century, the Roman calendar included 159 holidays. So, you were probably not working more than a third of the time. By the way, that continued into the Middle Ages. People think medieval serfs were worked to death, but about 1/3 of their time was spent celebrating various church holidays and saints' days where they didn't work either. So going to work, 5 days a week, every day of the week, with a day off for Christmas and New Year's, is a very recent development. So in Rome, you had 159 very different holidays, and 93 of those days included free games at the public expense. So basically paid for with tax money. And the government would put on free games. There would be sports like foot racing, boxing, wrestling. Again, Paul talks about this a lot if you read his letters. Paul was clearly a sports fan because, he discusses racing. He talks about, people who run for the prize. He talks about boxing, people, and wrestling. So he mentions all these different games, which were very popular. There were others, again, that were more brutal. For example, sometimes the big amphitheaters like the Colosseum would be flooded. The area in the middle would be flooded, and they would actually reenact famous naval battles with real ships armed with slaves where they would actually fight and kill each other. So very, very violent. And this was very entertaining for the people because they wanted to see violence. Of course, every Christian has heard about people being fed to the lions. That did happen to the Christians, but it happened to other people as well. It happened to other criminals, or if they didn't have anyone else, they just might send out a slave to, fight wild animals. And again, this was all for the entertainment of the mob. Chariot racing, like in Ben-Hur, was very, very popular. In Rome, the Circus Maximus, which was the giant racing track, had a seating capacity of 150,000. And it was the largest and oldest of 6 chariot racing tracks just in Rome itself. And then, of course, there were plenty of others in cities throughout the empire. Charioteers were usually slaves that were trained by wealthy owners. They would have been very valuable slaves because training was expensive. But it wasn't like, a nice sedate, race around the track. Chariot racing was basically the ancient form of like demolition derby, where you would crash into it and smash and disable your opponent. There are frequent collisions, there are injuries, there are deaths. Supposedly, even when they filmed the very first version of Ben-Hur, the black and white silent version, supposedly a stuntman was actually killed during the chariot racing sequence. Not sure if that's a myth or not, but they were, even reenactments were very dangerous. Spectators would bet on teams. You would have absolutely fanatical fan followings. In fact, there's a lot of graffiti in places like Rome and Pompeii, where people were basically putting the ancient Rome equivalent of, my team is number 1 on the walls everywhere. So a lot of aspect of celebrity culture that we see nowadays was not that different back then. Famous chariot racers, even though they were slaves, they could gain a lot of fame. They could gain money. Gladiators too. Gladiators and chariot racers, the popular ones, would actually endorse products. You would have ads where gladiators and chariot racers would endorse like your guy's olive oil. Any of you ever seen the movie Gladiator with Russell Crowe? Classic. There was actually a scene in that where they had him endorse like olive oil or something, and it was cut because they were afraid the audience would think it wasn't believable, but it's completely accurate. Celebrity culture was very similar now then as it is now. And so chariot racers, even though they were slaves, could gain a lot of wealth, a lot of fame, and could even buy their freedom. And of course, the most famous of the Roman games were, of course, the gladiatorial games. I've already mentioned last time that Roman society was centered around what we would call the martial values. They valued courage, they valued strength, they valued, being willing to fight in the face of death. And that's what the gladiatorial games were all about. So the Roman culture was obsessed with the martial arts, obsessed with violence, obsessed with bloodshed, and these type of fights were the most popular form of entertainment. The historian Keith Hopkins says, Rome was a cruel society. Brutality was built into its culture in private life as well as in public shows. The tone was set by military discipline and slavery. And Roman military discipline was brutal. I mean, basically, if you disobeyed your commanding officer, you were killed on the spot. So their military discipline was brutal, and that very much influenced the rest of their culture. And gladiators were often slaves who were trained to fight one another or fight wild beasts. They weren't all slaves. A freedman could become a gladiator. And many of them did because, again, fame, money, women. There were even women gladiators. They weren't that common, but they did exist. As they would enter the arena, the classic line, they'd address the emperor or the person who was the head of the games and saying, "We who are about to die salute you." Now, not all gladiators died. Fights were not always to death. In fact, they usually weren't to the death. Because, again, a gladiator was a very well-trained slave. It cost a lot of money to train a gladiator. Just huge amounts of money were sunk into them. So, the owners would not have wanted all gladiator fights to be to the death, because you wouldn't want to, lose the chance of losing that kind of investment with every gain. So it was more common for gladiator fights to either be to first blood or to some set amount of blows or that sort of thing. And gladiators had a physique that allowed them to survive. They weren't like ripped. They were strong, but they also put on a lot of body weight because that basically protected their vital organs. If you got slashed, but it was all fat, you're not going to die. If you're out there with like a ripped 6-pack abs and you get hit, game over. So they were well trained, and they were, they were proportioned in such a way that as to provide the maximum amount of bloodshed for a relatively small amount of actual death. But if a gladiator was seen by the crowd as not being courageous enough, as not fighting well enough, the crowd could call for his death. And the emperor or whoever was in charge of the games might very well, give the sign to kill him if the crowd was displeased. So the crowd was, the mob was an integral part of the games. They would, basically act like girls at a Beatles concert. They'd be there screaming, cheering, or, cursing if they thought the gladiators weren't providing a good enough show. So, gladiatorial games were obviously very dangerous. They were very bloody. Again, they were designed to provide maximum bloodshed. They weren't quite as lethal as you might think, but obviously death was hardly unknown. Again, gladiators who were very successful would become heroes. They would become celebrities and could very well gain their freedom. And a lot of times after they gained their freedom, they would go on to run gladiatorial schools of their own, which, could be a very lucrative profession. So Roman entertainment tended to be very bloody. Not all of it, again, you don't get that bloody when you're racing a foot race, but a lot of it was. And again, even things like execution of criminals was done for public entertainment, which actually is something that was a fairly common thing until recently. Middle Ages, the local, hanging was very much a public spectacle. So the idea of executions not being public is a pretty recent one. So criminals and slaves could be fed to lions, and of course that included Christians. Now there was a purpose to these beyond just sheer bloodlust. And basically the gladiatorial games especially, and the fake naval battles, were there to allow the populace to sort of vicariously experience the glory of Roman war. Because Rome was an incredibly militaristic society. The Roman Empire was built on conquest. Basically, if the empire wasn't out there conquering new people, it was dying. So the Roman Empire was built on military conquest, and so the people were constantly being fed this propaganda promoting war, and the gladiatorial games and these other things were very much a part of that. It was also a way of keeping up the spirits of the people and keeping up the spirits of soldiers. One historian wrote, for more than 2 centuries, thanks to its defense by frontier armies, the inner core of the Roman Empire was virtually insulated from the direct experience of war. If you didn't live on the frontier, you weren't really feeling threatened. You were under the Pax Romana. You didn't feel in the immediate threat of war. So, in memory of their warrior traditions, the Romans set up artificial battlefields in cities for public amusement. And this also gave the common people a way of feeling like they had some kind of power, which again is a very pacifying thing. If you feel like you have power over someone else, you're less likely to revolt against those who have power over you. So by giving the mob this power of life and death over, the people in these games, it kept them from feeling like they needed to revolt against those who have power over them. So the gladiatorial games and these others were seen as very vital to Roman stability. Because again, nothing was more important to the Roman aristocracy and the Roman government than that the people were pacified, that the Roman Empire was stable, and that the tax money just kept rolling in. Now, gladiatorial games were controversial even outside of the Christians, who clearly opposed them, but of course had no power of their own for the first 3 centuries. But there were philosophers who called the games useless frivolities. They called them wasteful and excessively violent. However, there were other philosophers who admired them, who thought that the games showcased the best of Roman endurance, courage, and strength. The Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who was known as a great Stoic philosopher, did not like the games. He visited them only because he was more or less expected to as emperor.
What was Stoic?
We talked about that last time. So basically the Stoics were sort of the most moral of the Roman philosophical schools. And they had a morality that was actually fairly close to Christian morality. And as such, Marcus Aurelius very much did not like the games, even though he didn't like Christians either. He was one of the great persecutors of Christians, but he had his own code of morality. Of course, the Christians condemned it completely. Tertullian, one of the early church fathers, said that the theater is lasciviousness, because a lot of Roman and Greek drama was very lewd and very pornographic. The circus, which was where you had the races and the chariots and all that, was suspense, and he said the arena was cruelty. So there were some Romans who opposed these games, but they were few and far between. For the most part, Roman amusements, which were fully enjoyed by the Roman people, were cruel and barbaric to an extent that we really could not comprehend nowadays. So, questions? As I say, right before everyone's about to go watch guys slam into other guys and possibly cause injuries.
You mentioned hangings. It drew entertainment.
Yeah.
The guillotine, where was that played?
So the guillotine was invented during the French Revolution. And it was specifically invented as a more merciful means of execution as opposed to beheading someone. Because by the time of the French Revolution, lower class people were hanged because that was really brutal. If you were part of the aristocracy, you were beheaded. That was seen as a more merciful death. Think about like Anne Boleyn and the like. But even then, people don't realize how hard it is to chop through a human neck. And it would usually take multiple blows. So the guillotine was designed to be quick, to be merciful. And that was what it was originally proposed as part of the idealistic start of the French Revolution, which was all about, equality between the noble classes and the peasants before it became just a total bloodshed. But the idea was to introduce a merciful form of execution that would be used for everybody. And of course, then it became the symbol of just killing everybody. Interestingly, any idea of the date, the year that the last person was guillotined, the last time the guillotine was used?
No.
Anybody want to guess? What, Aaron?
170 BC?
Nope. 1977.
Really? They
Where?
were still using it in World War II.
Yeah, no, it was the sort of classic way of putting it is that the last person was guillotined the same year that Star Wars came out. Also the year I was born. So,
Where was it?
in France. Yeah, I mean, it remained, I don't think there are many other places outside of France that ever used it. It's interesting. Did any of you ever watch the incredibly cheesy Thief in the Night movies from the late 70s, early 80s? You know, the one about like, they were sort of the 70s version of Left Behind, but somehow even worse.
They used it in Left Behind.
They did? So that was in the state they had him because, you know, the Bible talks about, you know, the saints in the tribulation being beheaded. They had them using the guillotine in those movies. But yeah, I didn't know they used it in Left Behind.
Yeah, the Left Behind books they do, yeah.
Okay. I never read the books. What, Perrin?
As the emperor, couldn't he just say, can he like just, why was he required to go to the games?
Because even the emperor had to keep the people happy or they might overthrow him.
Okay, but could he just order, like saying the emperor does not have to go to the games?
No, it was expected, so he did it.
Okay.
It
Just thinking.
seems kind of funny they had these games to keep the people from rioting, but yet the games now seems like that's where the riots are.
Yeah. English soccer hooligans. Yeah, but well, it wasn't just rioting. They were afraid they would revolt. I mean, so they really wanted to keep them occupied. And I'm sure there probably was some riot and thing that they got out of hand, but it wouldn't have been directed at the aristocracy, and that's all they really cared about. Anything else? Okay, so that's the end of part 2. So for part 3, we're going to switch gears again. We're going back to a more historical overview. And in part 3, which we're going to just a little bit started on today, we're now going to look at what happened right after the New Testament. Personally, I think for various reasons that the entire New Testament was written by AD 70, by the time of the Jewish Wars. So we're going to look at the Jewish Wars. And so basically what happened to Judea and Galilee and the early church in that area a few decades after the founding of the church.
So this would all be the intertestament period?
No, this would be after the Testaments. The intertestamental period we went over at the beginning. That was like the Maccabees and all that sort of stuff. This is after the New Testament. So this is what happened, this is some of the stuff that Jesus predicted, but I believe, the New Testament was completely written before it happened. So basically, you had the Zealot revolt, which started in 66 AD and went to 73 AD. And your last map in the very back of your notes shows what was going on with the first Judean revolt, the Zealot revolt or the Great Revolt. Now, the Jews, unlike a lot of people who lived under the Roman Empire and could be quite proud to be part of the Roman Empire, the Jews never felt happy there. Other than people like the Sadducees, who were more like collaborators, the Herodians, most Jews were never happy living under the Romans. No one persisted as stubbornly to Roman occupation, both politically and spiritually, as the Jews did. So from the time of Herod the Great, basically from the beginning of Roman occupation, patriotic Jews chafed under Roman rule. For example, Herod actually ordered a golden eagle, which was the symbol of the Roman Empire, to be hung above the temple gate to honor the Romans. And when he did that, some rabbis persuaded a group of young men to go and cut it down in protest, which Herod then went and ordered those rabbis and the youths to be burned alive. So there was trouble right from the beginning. And Jewish leaders were very much divided in how to respond to Roman rule as we talked about before, the Sadducees, which were the religious elite, mainly collaborated with the Romans, which is how they stayed the elite. They collaborated with the Romans. That got them special privileges. That got them power. They got them social status. The Pharisees were much more anti-Roman. They didn't like the Romans. Now, some Pharisees did argue that Roman rule was God's punishment for Israel's sins. So still a negative thing, but a negative thing condoned by God. Whereas other Pharisees, rabbis, and so-called prophets called for armed insurrection. And it was these peoples that would eventually give rise to the group that would later be called the Zealots, which were the foremost anti-Roman group. And the Zealots weren't really a single group. They were a coalition of violent terrorist guerrilla fighters. I mean, they really were what today we would call terrorists. And in fact, you had a faction called the Sicarii, who were actually fanatical assassins. They were almost kamikaze-like, in the way they go after, officials and the like. So throughout the first half of the first century, during the time of Jesus and for the couple decades after, you had multiple fanatical revolutionaries who would rise up and fight against the Romans. These included people like Judas the Galilean, Simon of Perea, Athronges, Theudas, and an Egyptian Jew whose name we don't know, but who is actually referenced in the New Testament. We talked about all of these in the first part of the class. But these were just different Jewish, basically guerrilla leaders who were fighting against the Romans. Usually didn't last very long. But there was a period during the time of Jesus and shortly afterwards where things were mainly peaceful in Judea and Samaria and Galilee. And you did have some Roman rulers like Herod Agrippa the first, who was actually fairly decent, who knew how to deal with the Jews and wasn't too oppressive. But in 44 AD, when Agrippa the first died, the relations between the Rome and the Jews deteriorated very quickly. Agrippa had been a grandson of Herod the Great. He had been very popular. He had actually began construction of a new wall on the northern side of Jerusalem, which Josephus claimed would have made the city impregnable had it been finished, but it never was. But when Agrippa the first died, instead of him being replaced with an heir or him being replaced with at least someone with some Jewish heritage, because the Herods all had some Jewish heritage, the Roman Senate appointed a procurator, just an outside person to come and rule directly over Judea. And these Roman governors tended to be very arrogant, corrupt, and contemptuous of the local population. So they didn't really care about pandering to Jewish sensibilities. In fact, they could be very provocative to Jewish sensibilities because, from their point of view, they were Romans. The Jews should be, adapting to them. So at this point, pressure really begins to build. You had a series of very unpopular rulers, and you're, leading towards just a major explosion of outrage and violence. So by the time you get to the early 60s, things are really getting bad. Relations between Jews and Romans in Judea are just at an all-time low. Because if you remember from when we talked about it before, relations between the Jews and Rome early on were actually kind of good. They started out fairly happy with the Romans, and things just got worse and worse over time. But in the early 60s, a man named Joshua, or Yeshua, son of Hananiah, appeared in Jerusalem prophesying gloom and doom. Supposedly, every day he walked the streets crying, "Woe, woe to Jerusalem, a voice against the city and the holy temple, and a voice against this whole people." So not surprisingly, this type of gloom and doom and condemnation of the state of the Jews at the time infuriated the priests, because basically he was, calling out the priests as being very corrupt. So they dragged him before the Roman governor, who scourged him until his flesh was shredded and his bones protruded, according to the records at the time. After that, he was let go, because unlike Jesus, they saw him more as a lunatic than an active threat. But for the next 7 years, he continued to walk around Jerusalem, prophesying death and destruction. So this was sort of the first forewarning that things were getting bad. And again, the overall mood, the morale of everyone was just getting worse and worse and worse. So this is a good point to stop. Any last questions?
Last Sunday we were not here, but we listened to it. The word when you were leaving the babies out to die.
Infanticide just means killing of babies.
How you spell it?
Infant, like I-N-F-A-N-T, and then I-side, like genocide. It's infanticide. So infant, I-C-I-D-E. Actually, at the time, that was what they called it was exposure. They would talk about exposing their infants. Basically just exposing them to the elements or the wild animals or whatever. Yes, Mary?
What are gorilla things? You mentioned them.
Yeah, so gorilla doesn't mean like a big monkey type thing. Gorilla here means people who would like hide and then come and like fight the Romans and when they weren't expecting it and then run off. They weren't like fighting a normal war.
Guerrilla warfare.
Yes, very much so.
Lesbos Island, where is that? Where is it located?
The what now?
You mentioned
Lesbos.
Curious? The island of Lesbos. No, it's one of the Greek islands. It's in the Aegean Sea.
Okay.
Anything else? All right. Well, next time we will start in on the Jewish wars.